In Part 1, we covered the relationship between Mackenzie Shirilla and Dominic Russo, a cycle of intensity, control, and reconciliation that ended when Mackenzie drove a car into a brick wall at nearly 100 miles per hour, killing Dominic and their friend Davian Flanagan. We covered the investigation that turned an accident into a murder case. Thousands of messages, vehicle data showing full acceleration and zero braking, a timeline that pointed toward intent. But the investigation was only the beginning. What followed was a trial that gripped the nation, a verdict that divided opinion, and a Netflix documentary that brought millions of new voices into the debate. This is Part 2, the trial, the evidence, the verdict, and the questions nobody can answer. If you are new here and this is your first time hearing about this case, hit subscribe. We go deep on the stories that stay with you. When Mackenzie Shirilla was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder plus felonious assault, the announcement sent shockwaves through Strongsville and far beyond. The public reaction split immediately. Some saw a clear case of intentional murder. Others questioned whether a 17-year-old could really have made a calculated decision to kill two people, including someone she claimed to love. But prosecutors were confident. They had the vehicle data showing deliberate acceleration with no braking. They had thousands of messages documenting a relationship that had become a pressure cooker. And they had a timeline that placed Mackenzie Shirilla behind the wheel with a motive that they argued was as old as human nature itself. If I cannot have you, nobody will. The charges carried enormous weight. Murder requires proof of intent, not recklessness, not negligence, not a terrible mistake. The prosecution had to prove that Mackenzie Shirilla acted with purpose to cause death, that she knew what she was doing, that she meant it. And in a decision that raised eyebrows across the legal community, Shirilla waived her right to a jury trial. The case would be decided by a single person, Judge Nancy Margaret Russell. The decision to waive a jury trial is one of the most consequential choices any defendant can make. It means putting your fate in the hands of one person, a judge, rather than 12 citizens who must reach a unanimous decision. For the defense, the logic was straightforward. The case had already attracted national media attention. Potential jurors had likely seen the coverage, read the headlines, and formed opinions. A judge, the theory goes, is trained to set aside pretrial exposure and focus solely on the evidence admitted in court. There was another calculation at play. Bench trials often move faster than jury trials. The defense may have believed that a streamlined proceeding would limit the emotional impact of victim testimony and keep the focus on legal arguments rather than grief. But there was a risk too. A single judge has no one to convince but herself. There are no holdouts to persuade, no compromises to negotiate. If the judge believes the prosecution's case, there is no jury room debate. There is just a verdict. Judge Nancy Margaret Russell, no relation to Dominic Russo, a coincidence that nonetheless added an uncomfortable layer to the proceedings, was now the sole arbiter of Mackenzie Shirilla's fate. The prosecution built its case on 3 pillars, and each one, on its own, was compelling. Pillar 1. The crash data. The vehicle's event data recorder captured the final seconds in unforgiving detail. The accelerator pedal was fully depressed. The speed climbed from normal driving speeds to nearly 100 miles per hour in a matter of seconds, and there was no evidence of braking. None. Not a tap, not a hesitation. The prosecution's accident reconstruction expert walked the court through what this meant. A driver traveling at that speed on that road approaching a visible building would have had time to react, to brake, to steer, to do something. Mackenzie Shirilla did nothing. The prosecution argued that doing nothing while pressing the accelerator to the floor was, in fact, doing everything. Pillar 2. The relationship evidence. Then came the messages. Thousands of them, extracted from both phones, organized chronologically, displayed for the court. The prosecution did not just show the messages. They showed the pattern, the cycle of control, the escalation of conflict, the desperation that bled through the texts in the days before the crash. They showed messages where Mackenzie demanded to know where Dominic was, who he was with, why he had not responded. Messages that shifted from affection to accusation within the span of a single conversation. Messages that, in the prosecution's telling, revealed a young woman who had decided that if she couldn't keep Dominic Russo, no one would. And they showed the most damning messages of all communications from the final 72 hours that referenced the relationship ending, that carried a tone of finality that seemed to point toward a decision already made. Pillar 3. The timeline. The prosecution overlaid the message timeline with the physical timeline of the final night. The party. The tension witnesses described. The decision to get in the car. The route taken. The crash. The convergence was powerful. This wasn't random. This was not an accident that happened to occur during a rough patch. This was, the prosecution argued, the culmination of a pattern that had been building for months. And hey, if you are finding this breakdown as intense as we did researching it, hit subscribe. We cover cases that go deeper than the headlines, and you will not want to miss what's coming. The defense faced a steep climb. The crash data was hard to explain away, but they mounted a vigorous, multi-pronged argument. First, the medical defense. Mackenzie Shirilla had suffered a traumatic brain injury in the crash. She had no memory of the collision or the moments leading up to it. The defense argued that the absence of memory didn't prove intent, and that it was equally consistent with a medical event like a seizure or loss of consciousness that could explain the acceleration without implying deliberate action. Second, the alternative explanation. What if she had been impaired? What if she had fallen asleep at the wheel? What if a medical emergency, something undiagnosed, something that left no trace, had caused her to lose control? The defense argued that the prosecution was asking the court to infer the worst possible explanation from data that could, in theory, support other interpretations. Third, the relationship evidence was overblown. Turbulent teenage relationships are common. Intense messages do not equal murderous intent. The defense argued that the prosecution was taking ordinary relationship drama and retroactively framing it as evidence of a crime, asking the court to read sinister meaning into communications that were, in context, the messy but normal conflicts of young love. The defense also pointed to something uncomfortable. Mackenzie Shirilla was 17, a teenager. Her brain, by every scientific standard, was not fully developed. Could a 17-year-old really have formed the calculated intent required for a murder conviction? The trial featured testimony from dozens of witnesses, friends who had been at the party on the final night, family members who had observed the relationship from the outside, digital forensics experts who had extracted and analyzed the messages, accident reconstruction specialists who had studied the crash. Friends from the party described an evening that had started normally but shifted as the night wore on. Tension, arguments, a feeling in the room that something was off. None of them could point to a single moment when everything changed, but multiple witnesses described the same instinct. It was time to leave. Family members testified about what they had seen and what they wished they had seen sooner. Dominic's parents described a son who had seemed increasingly stressed, increasingly caught up in something he couldn't control. They spoke about the moments they now recognized as warning signs and the guilt of having missed them. The digital forensics experts walked the court through the extraction process, how they recovered messages, including deleted ones, and how they reconstructed conversations that the participants may have believed were private and gone forever. And the accident reconstruction experts delivered testimony that was, for many observers, the most devastating of all. The data, they explained, was not ambiguous. The car accelerated deliberately. There was no mechanical failure. There was no evidence of any attempt to stop. On August 21, 2023, Judge Nancy Margaret Russell delivered her verdict, guilty, on all counts. The judge's ruling was direct. The crash was not an accident. It was not the result of impairment or a medical emergency. It was, she found, a deliberate act, one that ended 2 young lives. For the families of Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan, the verdict brought something that had been absent for more than a year: accountability. Someone had been held responsible, but the moment was not triumphant. It was devastating, because no verdict could bring back what they had lost. The sentencing hearing that followed has been described by those who attended as one of the most emotionally devastating proceedings they had ever witnessed. Christine Russo, Dominic's mother, approached the podium. She spoke about her son not as a victim in a true crime story, but as a person. His laugh, his dreams, the career he was planning. The family he wanted to have. The future that was stolen from him on a road in Strongsville. She spoke about what it means to lose a child. Not to illness, not to accident, but to violence, to a decision made by another human being who had claimed to love him. Scott Flanagan, Davian's father, followed. He spoke with a dignity that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. He talked about Davian's achievements, his athletics, his community involvement, the person he was becoming, talked about the hole in his life that would never be filled. And then he said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. His son was in the back seat. He had no control. He was simply there. Judge Russo sentenced Mackenzie Shirilla to 2 concurrent terms of 15 years to life in prison. 15 years before eligibility for parole. 15 years, and even then, parole is not guaranteed. Mackenzie Shirilla was 17 when she drove that car into a wall. She will be in her 30s before anyone even considers the possibility of her release. In the American legal system, a conviction is rarely the end. Shirilla's legal team filed appeals, arguing that errors during the trial warranted either a reversal or a new trial. The appeal focused on several issues: whether certain evidence should have been admitted, whether the crash data had been properly interpreted, whether the bench trial format had been appropriate for a case of this magnitude, and whether the evidence, while suggestive, truly met the legal standard for murder, whether intent had been proven or merely inferred. The appellate process is slow. Months passed, families waited, and when the rulings finally came, they were definitive. The appeals were denied. The conviction stood. For the Russo and Flanagan families, this was the end of the legal road. For Mackenzie Shirilla, it meant the sentence would stand years in prison, with no guarantee of release even when parole eligibility arrives. In 2024, the case reached a global audience when Netflix released The Crash, a documentary examining the Shirilla case in detail. The documentary brought the story to millions of viewers who had never heard of Strongsville, Ohio. It presented the evidence, interviewed people connected to the case, and explored the questions the trial had tried to resolve. And then something interesting happened. The public debate reignited more intensely than ever. Some viewers came away convinced of Shirilla's guilt. The vehicle data, the messages, the timeline to them, the evidence was overwhelming. Others were less certain. They questioned whether the prosecution had truly proven intent beyond a reasonable doubt, or whether a troubled teenager had been convicted based on a story that fit the evidence but did not necessarily prove it. The Netflix documentary did not create this divide. It exposed it, and it ensured that the case would not fade quietly into the archives. Subscribe if you want us to cover more cases that the documentaries don't fully answer. We dig into the evidence they leave out. Why does this case still divide opinion years after the verdict? Because at its core, the case against Mackenzie Shirilla was built on inference. There is no video of her deciding to kill. There is no confession. There is no witness who saw her make the choice. The prosecution asked the court to connect dots, and the court did. But not everyone is convinced the dots connect the way the prosecution claimed. Could the crash have been a medical emergency? Could it have been catastrophic recklessness that stopped short of murderous intent? Could the relationship evidence, however troubling, have been over-interpreted by investigators who had already decided what happened? These questions do not have easy answers, and that is precisely why the debate continues. Dominic Russo was 19. He had his whole life ahead of him. Davian Flanagan was 20. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mackenzie Shirilla was 17. She is now serving 15 years to life. 3 young people, 2 dead, 1 in prison, and a case that continues to generate debate years after the gavel fell. The questions this case raised about relationships, about intent, about how we determine guilt when the evidence is circumstantial, those questions remain open. They will likely remain open for as long as people continue to discuss what happened in Strongsville, Ohio. On July 31, 2022, this is not a story with a satisfying ending. What it offers is reflection on how ordinary relationships can conceal extraordinary danger, on how the search for justice can reveal truths that are harder to accept than anyone expected, and on how, even when a verdict is delivered, the questions don't always go away. For more deep dive investigations, subscribe and turn on notifications. And tell us in the comments, do you believe the right verdict was reached?